Hello there. Today I wanted to take a look at a rather special New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. This is the Hunting Lodge's 2021 Waimauku Sauvignon Blanc, sometimes referred to as the Homeblock. It's from Waimauku in West Auckland, and my reason for suggesting that this is quite a significant Sauvignon Blanc is the fact that this is from the vineyard where Sauvignon Blanc was first planted commercially in New Zealand. The Hunting Lodge is the site of what used to be Matua Valley winery that was set up by the Spence brothers, Bill and Ross. It was sold to Treasury Wine Estates, and the point was, for Treasury, the majority of the wine that they were making was being made down in Marlborough, and eventually they chose to sell off the winery in Waimauku, which is just north of Auckland, because it didn't make huge commercial sense to have the operations so split up. When Treasury chose to sell the estate, it was about 6 or 7 years ago, they sold it to the Sutton group, who were involved in dairy farming, and Brent and Denise Sutton renamed the site after the Hunting Lodge, the restaurant that was on the site, and have done quite a lot to revigorate it. And actually, if you visit Auckland, it's quite a nice site to visit in terms of being able to taste, and there's a restaurant there, etc. Back in 1968, the two brothers, Ross and Bill Spence, acquired Sauvignon Blanc cuttings from Joe Corbin of Corbin's winery. He had a block that he planted for the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries as an experiment in his vineyard in Kumu, and it was about to be grubbed up. And the Spence brothers had tried Sauvignon Blanc when they'd studied winemaking in California and were interested in trying to make some commercially, and he told them they could help themselves to cuttings. So this was 1968. They produced their first commercial vintage of Sauvignon Blanc in 1974, just 400 cases at that stage, and it didn't really sell very well. However, the plantings in Waimauku became the source block for most of the early plantings of Sauvignon Blanc in Marlborough. It's in 1973 that Montana became the first modern winery to plant vines in Marlborough, and then in 1980 they released their first Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. Subsequent to that, the rise of the recognition of Marlborough and its Sauvignon Blancs has been really quite phenomenal. I say that this comes from the site where those original plantings were. These are some of New Zealand's oldest Sauvignon Blanc vines, but planting of the vines that this comes off occurred between 1979 and 2008. So there are none of those original vines still existing, but presumably these would have been propagated using cuttings from those original vines. The fruit for this wine comes from the Spence, Margan and Watson blocks around the vineyard in Waimauku. Soils here are quite a heavy clay, which can be difficult in wet years because the clay is quite good at holding quite a lot of water, and it can make the vines quite vigorous, make them prone to produce too much leaf cover. However, 2021 was a lovely warm, dry vintage, following on from 2020, similarly warm and dry. But this was really quite an exceptional season. Fruit was hand-picked, it was sorted in the winery, it was destemmed, and it was pressed. The juice was then kept cold and allowed to settle. This gave very clean juice. For barrel fermentation, a certain amount of solids were retained to try and give more character to the wine. Fermentation went on with indigenous yeasts and took place in French oak barriques, so 225 litre barrels, relatively small barrels. About 25% of those were new, but they were all French oak. And the notes I've seen claim there was no winemaker intervention whatsoever, so the juice was simply put into the barrels and allowed to ferment of its own accord. It stayed in barrel for 8 months after fermentation, allowing the wine to age with the yeast lees still there. And bottling took place on the 16th of February 2023, almost a year after vintage. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? Looking at it, it's a relatively deep colour for a Sauvignon Blanc. I suppose it's spent a bit of time in oak. For that reason, it's a little older than one might normally drink Sauvignon Blanc. But yes, it's a medium yellow colour, with perhaps greenish hints. Looking at it, the wine has 13.5% alcohol. It is throwing some tears on the glass, but they're not particularly prominent. The aromas are incredibly complex. Firstly, there are some really pungent Sauvignon Blanc notes. There's notes of asparagus, passion fruit, perhaps gooseberry, a little bit of cut grass. There's a tiny touch of minerally notes, sort of suggesting some fermentation aromas from the yeasts there. Yes, it's complex. There's perhaps a little bit of salinity, saline notes coming from the oak, perhaps. So let's taste it and see what we make of that. On the palate, the wine is dry. It has far more roundness and weight than I'd normally expect from a Sauvignon Blanc. It's normally quite a thin, delicate wine. This has got a little bit of creamy texture to it. I mean, it's still only medium-bodied at best. There are saline notes. There's notes of vanilla oak there. There's a creaminess, as I say, to texture and flavour. But behind that sort of slightly salty, slightly smoky note, there is this sort of juicy passion fruit with touches of asparagus. There's a green, leafy and a grassy touch. But again, the 13.5% alcohol is giving a little bit of weight to the finish. There's a rounded, creamy texture to the finish, which is giving it some weight. There's reasonable length. And again, this sort of slightly saline note just at the finish. It's a complex, reasonably weighty wine for a Sauvignon Blanc, probably richer than most. The winery's notes describe it as a Sauvignon Blanc for Chardonnay lovers, which it makes some sense. I think actually it's got a lot of really good Sauvignon Blanc character. It's slightly kept in check by the oak. It's not quite as ebullient as you would get if it was stainless steel fermented. The wine is still relatively young. I don't think it has a long age ahead of it, but you could keep it for 2 or 3 years. It's certainly got good fresh acidity. I haven't mentioned that. It's lovely and clean. It's perhaps got a lemony citric note to the finish, but at the same time it's balanced by a nice weight of fruit. So yes, thank you for watching. I hope you found the tasting of interest. If you've enjoyed it, do please like it. Do please consider sharing it with your friends. Do think about signing up and following us on YouTube. It'd be fantastic to have your support. If you have any comments either about the wine we're trying, the tastings we're doing, or anything else related to that, do please leave them in the comments box below. It'd be great to hear that. But most importantly, do see if you can make some time to join us for another tasting in the very near future. Thanks again.